I was going to say Katy Perry. We introduced Taylor Hawes. We were really lucky to learn about Taylor Hawes because her brother teaches at Taft. He's the head of the history department at Taft. But Taylor comes from Colorado. She serves as the program director for the Colorado River Project at the Nature Conservancy. I'm not going to steal too much of her thunder on the program, but she's been really instrumental and responsible for connecting people and water throughout the southwestern part of the United States and other countries, southwest of us country, and really trying to bring together biodiversity, sustainability, and human water use. She also serves as, as the governor's appointee to the Colorado Interbasin Compact Committee and is co-chair of the Basin Study Environmental and Flows Work Group. She's originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and she attended one of our rivals, St. Mark's School. She actually happened to be a student there when I was born.
Small world.
I was a faculty child at St. Mark's growing up. And she received her BA in Political Science from the University of North Carolina and her Juris Doctorate degree from Vermont Law School in 1997. Please welcome Taylor.
Thanks, Tony. Well, good morning, and thank you all for coming and being part of the discussion about sustainability and how we can create a path of sustainability for your generation, really. So in full disclosure, I am also recovering from a cold. I hope I don't go into a coughing attack. If I start drinking water madly, that's what I'm doing. So just so you know what's going on there. But I want to talk about today a few things. First, I want to talk about how important water is, why it's one of the most important natural resource issues facing your generation. I then will dive a little deeper into the Colorado River and some of the challenges that we're facing there, because the challenges we're facing there are also challenges that we're facing all over the world in different places at different times. And then I want to talk about a recent success story in the Colorado River where we reconnected the river to the sea for the first time in 20 years. And then I want to use that as an example to talk about how it might affect your work and how you might be able to make a difference in your community using some of the techniques that we used out there. So I did want to spend a second talking about the Nature Conservancy, because many of you might not know the Conservancy. It is the largest environmental nonprofit in the world. We sometimes call it an NGO, non-governmental organization, so I might use that term as well. But we work in all 50 states, 30 countries around the world, and we started as a land trust, meaning we found land that we thought was important ecologically, and we would just buy it. We would go out, raise the money, and purchase it, so we would take it out of the system. So we're unlike a lot of other environmental organizations that might do litigation or work through the regulatory process. We try to use the capitalistic system and markets to make change. And so we kind of take a little bit of a different approach in our work. But one of the things that we've realized along the way is that to really make a difference, we can't solve the problems facing nature unless we solve the problems facing our communities. And so that's one of our hallmark approaches. One of our other approaches that we spend a lot of energy on is science, good science. So if there's scientists in the room, people that are really interested in that, we employ over 600 scientists in our organization. So it's definitely a big focus of our work. Okay, jumping in here. So this probably doesn't need that much explanation, but we need water for life. We need water for everything we do. You cannot live more than 3 days without water. So just our bodies need water. But also think about our food. You can go 3 weeks without food, but we also have to have water to grow food. So we use it for our energy production, we use it for industry. All of your cell phones, those chips in there, they require water to be made. So it's part of everything that we do in all of the modern parts of our life that we take for granted. And of course, the natural world needs it too. Wildlife definitely needs it. As one of my colleagues likes to say, fish need water every day. So, part of our goal is to make sure that wildlife has the water that it needs as well. So just to give you a few kind of factoids about water, there is no substitute for water. It's not like oil or some of the other things that our technologies can change. There is a water cycle, and there's only so much water in the system. So what we've got today is what we had millions of years ago, and what we will have in the future as well. The average body, 55 to 70% water. If you're as a baby, it's even higher than that. So it's a big part of our system. And agriculture uses about 70% of our water, and that's one of the first things people kind of scratch their heads at. That's a lot of water. Most of our water is going to grow food. And just to put a finer point on that, if you've had a steak recently, it uses about 1,300 gallons to make one steak. And so think about all the people eating steak and all the people eating chickens and everything else, but everything that we eat requires water. Coffee takes a ton of water to produce. So just understanding that connection of what we call the water footprint, just like your energy footprint, is really important. And the other piece of that that's important to understand is you may not live in an area that is water scarce, but you may live in a place, but you're eating steak from the Midwest or from Colorado, or you're getting wine from, maybe not you guys, not all of you yet, but a lot of the things that come from other places are in water scarce regions. For example, California right now is in the grips of one of the most historic droughts on record, and it will affect food prices for decades because farmers are having to let avocado, almond trees just die because they don't have enough water to keep those trees alive. So it's really going to have an impact. So even though it may not feel that way here, we're so connected globally with our economy that it is all connected. And then taking a 5-minute shower, which probably most of us do every day, uses more water than a person in a slum in a developing country uses all day. So we're very fortunate here, but it's something we often take for granted. And then finally, by 2025, 2/3 of the world's population will be experiencing shortages. So we're starting to see shortages in places that where it's not just the West, where it's a desert, but we're also starting to see shortages in places like the Southeast, in Georgia, Alabama. We're seeing shortages in places like the Midwest, places that never had to deal with this. And part of that's because we're bumping up into an increasing population with the same amount of water that we've always had. So the other variable in this, or the wild card, is climate change. I know in different parts of the world, depending on where you are, there is often an ongoing debate about, is climate change real? Why is it happening? All those things. In the water management sector, we don't really care. The fact is we're seeing these changes now, so we're having to adapt now to a changing environment. And water managers will tell you it's irresponsible not to take these things seriously and try to figure out how to adapt to these changes. So we're seeing everything from more floods so we're seeing precipitation come all at once. Last year in Colorado, we had floods that were very severe. We had 18 inches of rain in 36 hours. We normally get 14 all year. So it was just, and our system just couldn't handle it. So we're having to learn how to deal with those challenges to make sure that we're ready, because as water managers say, we have to provide drinking water. This is a matter of human health and safety. So I want to turn to the Colorado River. Most of you, how many people have been to any of these basin states and been to the Colorado River? Okay, few to the Grand Canyon. Okay, so I want to point out just to orient you. So the headwaters are up here in Colorado, Wyoming. They kind of come together here. Parts of New Mexico, Utah has quite a bit. Here's Lake Powell. I'm going to refer to Lake Powell quite a bit, and Lake Mead. Here's Las Vegas over here. Comes down. California gets the biggest share of water from the Colorado River, and then Arizona, the entire state, is within the Colorado River basin. But there are two countries. It does flow down here into Mexico. 7 U.S. states rely on the river. Places like Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Denver, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Salt Lake City, a lot of big cities, some of the fastest growing states in the country. 36 million people relying on this river, and the number is growing. We don't even know how fast it's growing until we have a new census done. But we know that this number could double in the next 15 years. 4 to 5 million acres of agriculture. If you eat lettuce or carrots in the wintertime, you are getting produce from the Colorado River Basin. 99.9% of the produce is coming from this region right here. So we are connected in that sense. It also has a $26 billion recreation economy. This is a place where, a trip of a lifetime is going rafting down the Grand Canyon, or going fly fishing in some of the headwater rivers, or going skiing at Vail or Aspen. All of those places take water, make snow with it, so you're skiing on the rivers, essentially, on some of their main tributaries. So it's an important economic engine to our communities, yet if the river runs dry, what does that do to those recreational economies? It also has diverse wildlife. You think of the classic things, mountain lions, moose, elk, but we also have 43 native fish species. 30 of those are found nowhere else in the world. 4 of those have already gone extinct, and 16 are kind of on the edge. So we're not in great shape from an environmental standpoint, and that's one of the things that we're working on. It's also one of the most loved or litigated rivers in the world, depending on how you look at it. We fight over everything out there, and so it's a very contentious environment for people. And I am a lawyer, but one of the things I focus on is trying to find solutions, because we have enough litigation, frankly. So here's the problem that we're facing. Let me stand out here. This line right here is the demands on the river. This is a 10-year running average. You can kind of see it heading up here. This is the supply of the river, the 10-year running average as well. This period right here is when we divvied up the river. So there's a compact, which is a contract among the states that gives each state a certain amount of water. This was one of the wettest periods in history, and that's when we divvied up the river. So that's part of our problem, is that we did our math wrong, frankly. And then here is the problem. These 2 lines crossed about 6 years ago. That is starting to really scare water managers, and yet it's an opportunity to make changes in the way we manage this river. And the way we talk about it is it's a slow-moving train coming at us, and so it's our own fault if we don't get out of the way. But we do need to get out of the way. And this slide, these photos caught the public's attention. The photo over here is Lake Mead. It's 140 feet down. There's a huge bathtub ring, white ring around the reservoir. This is Lake Powell, same kind of thing. They're both below 50%. These are the 2 biggest reservoirs in the country. So it makes a big difference when you're looking at the situation of your water supply. These are our bank accounts, and so we're dipping into these bank accounts pretty heavily just to pay our regular bills. So any way you look at it, this is the math problem we're facing, and status quo is unacceptable. We have to find a new way of managing the river. So there's the other thing, when people learn about the Colorado River, they tend to know 2 things. One is it carved the Grand Canyon, and the other is it doesn't reach the sea anymore. It's one of the few rivers in the United States, I think it might be the only river in the United States that no longer reaches the sea. And a delta is where the river comes into the ocean, and in our case, it typifies or it exemplifies what's going wrong in the rest of the basin. So if you're in the Mississippi, the issue there is hypoxia. It's too many nutrients coming down from the basin or from the rest of the watershed. In our case, it doesn't even make it there because we're using so much of it and we're overusing it. And this right here, this is what the water flow used to be like in the Delta. And here's when Hoover Dam was built, big drop off. Here's where Glen Canyon, Lake Powell was built, big drop off. We had one big spike in the 80s, and pretty much it's been on a downward decline. This is the Colorado River coming down from Arizona and California. California's here, Arizona's here. Mexico takes all of this water off to irrigate fields. This is the river, and it dries up in about another mile downstream from this point. So it's pretty stark situation. And so, these are the challenges we're facing. We've got many interests that want this water. We've got an ongoing drought and climate change that's just changing the supply situation that we have, and our population is continuing to grow. So I'm a big believer in crisis is an opportunity, but you just have to recognize it as such and use it to take advantage of it to get changes. Because sometimes, we have so many things that we're struggling with as a community, a society, whether it's poverty or education or transportation, you name the issue, and it's economics. It's easy to focus on whatever is the crisis of the day. And so sometimes you have to take advantage of a crisis to be able to make changes. So just to give you a sense of the consequences we're facing in the West, Las Vegas is about 1.5 years away from not being able to get water to the city. That's a pretty big crisis, and it's a pretty big driver in our community. But basically the lake level, Lake Mead, is here, and there's a pipe that goes out to Las Vegas. And if that pipe is, it's just about 8 feet below the surface right now. And as we keep dropping, Las Vegas is getting very nervous. Can you imagine the city of Las Vegas running out of water? That's a pretty big deal, and it would literally be dry. And so we're not going to let that happen. So it's creating changes or opportunity for change. And Lake Powell, which is the upper basin reservoir I showed you, which is the top end of of the Grand Canyon, it's only a few years away from not being able to generate power. And that may not sound like that big of a deal, but in the Southwest, it is the linchpin of the entire Western grid. And so it's got all sorts of issues tied up in it, including if we lost that power, there's not enough power generated in the West to replace it. So we would be in a situation of likely having rolling brownouts like you see in developing countries, or there's some of the other power plants. If your power plant goes down, you still need a spark to light it back up again. So if there was a crash on the grid and we lost these power plants, we couldn't get them started again without Glen Canyon and this dam. And it also generates about $120 million in revenue that's going to help farmers. It's going to help with environmental programs. So it's part of our recovery programs. So that's $120 million a year that's going into our community that would disappear as well. So it has all sorts of implications for the upper basin too. So the solutions are being crafted right now, but it's up to us to make sure that those solutions include the environment. So I'm going to switch gears to talk about the Colorado River Delta, which is where we reconnected the river to the sea this year. And I'm going to show a quick clip from a partner of ours who did this clip for Outside Magazine.
Years ago, I followed this river, source to sea. What I learned in short is this iconic 1,500-mile ribbon of water has too many straws for the drink. This is where the mighty Colorado River comes to die. But in the spring of 2014, something happened. A river of sand became wet once again. To partake, we did what any river lovers would do. We floated it.
As you can see, pretty nice river right now.
It became a mission to try to reach the sea, come hell or no water.
We're not sure where it goes. It's just amazing to be able to do something that you don't know that you can finish.
So hot. Gotta be 110. Oh, crap, Don't worry, we don't need us.
So I just felt like the visuals for this is just so much more powerful than telling you the story. But this was a historic agreement between the United States and Mexico, and the environmental community was part of it, which is very, very unusual. And just by way of context, here we are in the middle of one of the worst droughts in history, and we made an agreement that not only provided water for our cities, for farmers in Mexico, but also for the environment. And so just to give you a little more context, we have a treaty with Mexico that governs, bless you, the Colorado River. It also governs the Rio Grande River in Texas. And so every time we amend this agreement or tweak it in any way, we call it a minute. It's a long history lesson there for you, which I won't give you today. So this is the 319th time we've amended this treaty, which was signed in 1944. So what was important about it and what was historic about it is it was more about sharing and finding a solution for sustainability, towards sustainability, finding something that worked for everybody. So just as an example about what I mean by sharing is Mexico had never been able to store its water in US reservoirs. So they just were at the whim of whenever the US decided to send water across the border, Mexico had to deal with it. They didn't have any way to store it. That gives them very little flexibility. So they now can store their water in US reservoirs, which gives them a lot more flexibility to time the water to when they need it most. There was binational investments in water conservation. So in 2010, Mexico suffered, there was a really significant earthquake over 7.2 on the Richter scale. Completely damaged the Mexicali Valley and all of the infrastructure these farmers used to move that water around and irrigate their crops. And so this was one of the things that, so I told you they can store their water in the US reservoirs now. This was a way that the cities in the US said, you need cash, we need water. You can't use all your water. We'll give you millions of dollars to repair your infrastructure, and in exchange, we'll get to keep a little bit of extra water for cities like Los Angeles and Las Vegas and Phoenix. So it was, again, lots of these kinds of things. I'm not going to go into all the details of the agreement, but those kinds of, win-win-wins were what we were searching for. And then the other thing that made it historic is that it was, there was a commitment by the US government and the Mexican government and the environmental community, a coalition of organizations, to put water back into the environment. And it is the only international agreement in the world that includes water for the environment. So truly historic. 260 rivers that cross international boundaries. This is the only one that has an environmental flow component to it, and considering the environment and how they structured the agreement. And then we also had a commitment to negotiate a long-term agreement. So this was a 5-year agreement. We are already we signed it in 2012. We're entering into the negotiation period for the next agreement. And our hope is that it will be more like a 20-year agreement, but again, that it will include benefits for the environment. So just to give you, again, a little bit of a perspective on this and some of the photos that we had. This is a before and after photo. This is our scientist, one of the Nature Conservancy scientists who helped design the pulse flow. So our goal here was to create a mini flood. What would this look like if there weren't all these dams? How would we create a mini flood that would, when the trees were blooming, kind of distribute the seeds and help restore this area? So you can see this is a real river. One of my favorite quotes from all the stories that came out about this was a guy from Paddler magazine said, he was out there paddling, it was all a video, and he said, they said this was an experiment, but it sure feels like a river to me. And it did. It was a river that came out of nowhere. I mean, it was a place that has looked like this for the last 20 years, where people were using it as a dragway and doing races, and now it was a river again. And so it was really, really exciting to see. And then this, just to clarify too, this only happened for 2 months. So the river is now dry again. It looks like this again. So it was just a 2-month experiment. And the river did reconnect. So this is the river coming down. This is the high tide coming up. And the river did reconnect to the sea on May 16th. And I will say that it was an experiment. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know if it would reach the sea. We knew there was a lot of groundwater pumping, so water was going into the ground. And so we had a slew of scientists out there monitoring, trying to understand what the impact was to the environment. But what we didn't count on was the response of the community. And I wish there's some other videos that are just incredible of the community coming out to watch the river come down. So there's a little town right on the border called San Luis Rio Colorado, and it's named for the river, and the river hasn't come through here in 17 years. And so this was actually very early on in the pulse flow event, the flood, but on Saturdays and Sundays, this was like a festival. People came out to celebrate the return of their river. A lot of them were like, why is this happening? They didn't have any idea what was going on, but they learned about it. It was on the front page of the paper. It was, there were the horse you saw, there were horse races, there was vendors out there. It was just this party-like atmosphere. And this is one of my favorite photos. There was just these kids that had never seen the river. So it taught us and reminded us that this isn't just about nature. This is about communities and people, and that rivers are important for people as well. So I'm going to turn to talking a little more about, how we did this. And I hope that what I can stress is how you all can think about your work, whatever it is, whether it's, whatever it is in your life that you care about. Maybe it's not today, maybe it's 10 years from now, but the way we did this was also very unique. These were the groups that were involved. We had Robert Redford involved, which was pretty exciting. But we also had these other environmental groups engaged in the conservation and into making this agreement. And so, there's always that question, it seems so hopeless, can we really make a difference? But this is one of my favorite quotes: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." Because at the end of the day, everything that we deal with is about people. Really, if we're gonna make a difference, we can be part of the problem or we can be part of the solution. And I think our experience on the Delta showed that it was absolutely possible if we banded together to find those relationships, build that trust, and find solutions. So I wanted to spend a few minutes kind of talking about the people that were involved. And the reason I want to do this is, is to highlight the different types of skill sets that were involved in making this happen, because all of you have different and unique skills, and all of you are trying to find the way to make a difference. Because you're here, I know that, but just to make sure that you understand how many different types of skills it takes to make this kind of thing happen. So Peter Culp was our attorney. The Nature Conservancy hired him to negotiate the agreement for the Environmental Coalition. But Peter, so one of the things I did in preparation for this was kind of reach out to these folks that I've worked with for years to learn their story. How did they become interested in working on this? What were their skill sets that they had as kids? And Peter said he was just fascinated with quantum mechanics and physics and what was the other one? Chaos theory, but also creative writing, which is kind of an unusual combination, but creative writing is excellent for an attorney to have. Lots of creative writing there. But Peter is just brilliant. And so, when he left college, he realized, the physics thing's really interesting, but he really enjoyed working with people. And so he spent 2 years as a long-haul truck driver, driving across the country, interacting with people. And he said he realized that he wanted to move into politics and law because it helped him. It was the combination of the physics and people is really politics and in kind of that social and government, those kinds of things. So it's kind of action, reaction. And so he's been incredible to work with. Osvel Hinojosa is one of our partners in Mexico. He's an ornithologist. He's also become recently a National Geographic explorer, so he gets to be one of these storytellers that National Geographic uses. But part of what makes him so successful, he has his PhD in biology and ornithology, but he is one of the nicest people you will ever meet. And so people always want to work with him because he's so easy to work with. But he never loses sight of what he's trying to do, which is bring back habitat for the wildlife. And then Carlos de la Pera, he is an academic. He works for one of the universities in Mexico. He became a critical ally. He's actually got his PhD in sustainability and environmental planning from Michigan. And he's served as he was stationed in DC at the embassy working as their minister, their liaison to the Minister of Environment. And his whole focus is the kind of economic sustainability of the border region between the US and Mexico. But why he became so important was he became a consultant to the Mexican government. He worked with us in the beginning to create the vision, but then he had a direct line to those people in Mexico. What made this all possible was Mexico said, we want to restore our environment. That changed everything. The US had to take it seriously at that point. And then Eloise Kendi, she is our environmental scientist. She's a hydrogeologist, a term you don't hear every day. But she, when I asked her what she loved in high school, she said it was math. And she loved science, except for chemistry and physics. And so she said she spent her whole career, up through college, trying to avoid taking chemistry and physics. But then she loved surfing. So she went to University of California at Santa Barbara so that she could fulfill this surfing dream, and instead they had a great geology program and hydrology program, so she got interested in that, and she said she spent the next 3 years taking chemistry and physics. So she doesn't always work out the way you think, but she has become she's been involved in so many important cases in this kind of how does water move and what do we need to know about that to make it work for us. And then this is Alexandra Cousteau. She's the great-granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau, who's one of the most famous marine researchers in the world. She started a foundation called, or a nonprofit called Blue Legacy, which kind of represents and honors her grandfather's legacy. Her brother works on marine, she works on rivers. And so she's been out telling the story about rivers and the challenges facing rivers in the world. And then Yamilet, or Yami, as we call her, her story is also interesting. Yami was, her background's in economics. She became a stockbroker in Mexico and quickly realized how much she hated it. And so her friend, she went to high school with Oswald. And so Oswald kept telling her about how great his work was and how exciting his work was, that he was making a difference in Mexico. And she kept thinking, I should try this out. So she started volunteering for him and for this organization he works for. And eventually she ended up in a situation where she came to work permanently for ProNatura, left being a stockbroker in Mexico City to work on this. And now she's been an integral part of the team. These two guys look a little different than the others. So Terry Fulp is the regional director for Bureau of Reclamation in this area that we're working. Terry has his PhD in engineering and modeling. He's the guy that figures out if you do this, what happens over here. But he also is very supportive of partnership, and he had a tough job, trying to please all these different stakeholders. And so when we came to him with a solution that could work for everybody, he was thrilled. And he was the one that kind of helped hold all the stakeholders together. And then this guy, John Ensminger, he is a lawyer, and I asked him what he loved in high school, and he said world history and government. So again, the lawyers tend to go a certain track. But he is now the head of the Water Authority in Las Vegas. So he's highly motivated to find solutions for the Colorado River Basin. We started working with him to figure out where our common ground was. And so I'll talk about that in a second. But he became a really critical ally as well. So all of these people brought different skills and interests and perspectives to make this a reality. So quickly, I'm just getting to the end here, but what is a successful partnership? And there's lots of layers in here. I can't get into all of them, but I wanted to give you a sense of kind of the movement. First, you have to have a vision. There's a line in a song that I've always liked is, you hit what you head for, you get what you ask. And so if you're ever riding your bike and you're looking down, have you ever noticed that you always hit what you're heading for? Like if you look at something, you're going to hit it. That's kind of how life is. And that's certainly how, if you have a vision, if there's something that you want to accomplish, you need to first come up with that vision. And so that was the first step. But then you have to build partnerships. You have to create those alliances. And to do that, you have to find that shared interest. And you have to understand, what is it that the person across the table needs to get out of this? Then you can start to really build a foundation. And then finally, you have to implement it successfully. So moving towards implementation, if you don't successfully implement, what was the point? It's all for nothing. So you've got to have this progression here. So in terms of our experience, it was really, there's so many other people that I could talk about, but I just am trying to use a few folks as example. But Peter and Oswald and Carlos, these were some of the guys that were down in the Delta back in the late 90s when we had the last flood event. And they saw that with just a little bit of water, we could restore this area. And so it was very powerful for them. They were the one that started to hatch this vision. And then they started bringing other people along into the discussions. And it started to really take shape and create this vision in which we could sell to our other stakeholders. But then you got to build partners. And in our case, the environmental community is often excluded from these kinds of negotiations. We were kicked out of the room so many times, I can't even tell you. I mean, it was 3 years of being kicked out of the room and coming back in. And it was these two guys that kept bringing us back in, saying we need to have the environmental community here. They're bringing resources, they're bringing solutions, they're bringing political will to do this, what we're trying to do here. So if we hadn't had these two partners, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have the agreement that we have today. And then finally moving into implementation. So Eloise was critical in designing this flood event. You've got to, as I said, it was an experiment. So we had to have somebody that could really kind of figure out when to release this water, how much to release, and then what did we expect the response to be. Likewise, Oswald was the birder. He's the ornithologist. So he was the one testing, and he had a team of scientists working with him to understand what exactly was the response for the birds? What was the response for the wildlife? We saw beavers down there. Everybody was like, where did they come from? Nobody knew there were beavers even down there anymore because it was like a huge surprise. But so he was watching the wildlife piece with his team of scientists. And then Alexandre Cousteau, you've got to have somebody to tell your story. That is the way our world works. People need to be excited about stuff. They need to understand that it's important. One of the things that we were struggling with during our implementation, this is the worst drought in record, and here we are releasing a bunch of water into the environment. We were concerned that would not go over very well. We were worried. So anyway, we spent a lot of energy making sure that we told the story well and in a positive way. So we had over 500 stories, whether video, media, newspaper, all positive. And that was by design. I mean, we needed to make sure this was positive so that when we negotiate the next agreement, we'd have a positive response. And then Yami, she's the one out buying water rights. So under the agreement, I didn't mention this, the two governments and the environmental community split the obligation to put water back in the environment or into the river, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So we had to come up with as much water as the US and Mexico did. We're buying that water from farmers in Mexico, willing sellers. It's less than 1% of their share, so we're not affecting what they have to use to grow food. But she's the one out there talking to the farmers and getting them to sell their water rights. And frankly, they're coming to us saying, I'm ready to get out of farming. I want my water to go back into the environment. So just to conclude, what does this mean for you guys? And I think that there were a couple lessons that kind of popped to mind as I was thinking about my presentation. And, it takes all types. Every single one of you has something to offer. You have skills, you have interests that you can foster that can be used for making a difference. You have to create that vision though, start, what is it that you care about? What is it that you want to change? It can be something small right now, but get in the habit of creating that vision because you've got to know what you want to accomplish to know whether you even succeeded. So, and then figure out who those alliances are. Who are those partners that make sense that would help you in accomplishing your goal? So it may be, I always say, strange bedfellows is the way we work. We're constantly reaching out to groups like farmers that aren't necessarily used to working with environmental organizations, but in our case, they see that we can do more together. And then honor your path. It's always easy I had a friend who used to say, always forward, never straight. And it's kind of, your path is going to take you in a lot of different directions. If you love surfing, go follow your dream and go surfing, but kind of keep that goal in mind that of what, your path is going to look different than everybody else's. And then many hands make light work. This idea of partnership, you are going to accomplish so much more by working together than you will by working by yourself. And so, to really make change in the world, you've got to work together. And that was for me, I worked in the water sector for 18 years in a very, very contentious setting with lots of people fighting over every drop. But if you can kind of create those partnerships, the political will turn and you'll be able to make that change. So with that, I am done and I'll take any questions. Any questions? And Jim.
I read a couple months ago on Pop Sci that Las Vegas is building a new tunnel.
Yep.
It's even further down. So how does that
Good question.
into the discussion?
Yeah, so I have to repeat this because I'm on video. So the question is, how does Las Vegas's new tunnel affect this whole discussion? They are at a race against time. They are trying to build it to be even lower in the reservoir, but even if they build it, it's not the same quality as the water on top of the reservoir. So the higher you are up in the reservoir, the better quality water. In the lower part, the treatment costs will be a lot higher than they will be from where they're taking the water from now. So even when they build this, it's for emergency, and it's still a couple years away. And so that's why I say we're about 1.5 years away from them being below the intake. and 2 years away from them being finished with that tunnel. So they're truly in a race against time. But they also have these other water quality costs. So they will prefer always to take water from the top of the reservoir. So I think they're trying to figure that out too, though. But that's, all of these cities are doing drastic measures to try to make sure that they're prepared for the future. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Katie?
I was curious, since the area in Mexico had been dry for so long, clearly a lot of the species that lived there had adapted to that new environment. Was there concern that by releasing the water for just a short period of time, you were going to, harm the species that had adapted to the drought and then taking the water away? I know you want to keep this story positive.
Yeah.
What about, the birds who had moved into those areas? Were you storing
Right.
nesting grounds? Or,
Right, that's a good question. Well, first of all, there's lots of other dry area in Mexico.
Right.
We only affected a small portion. But the biggest wildlife issue here is the birds. And there's 380 bird species that come through here on the Pacific Flyway going from South America to North America and back. And this has become a critical pinch point for them. So it's their first place that they can stop. And it used to be that Southern California had more habitat, and that's all disappearing. So this has become even more important. So what we're really focused on is creating habitat for birds. And so, for example, the environmentals group's share of water is to help keep water on these trees that we're growing right now for birds. And so we're not trying to change the whole environment. We're trying to really restore about 4% of the whole delta. So there are still species that are going to be slowly adapting, and I don't think we're going to be changing that, but we are trying to create a stopover, like a remnant habitat for these birds that are coming through. So you're right, though, it could be.
Well, I'm saying it's wonderful to try to restore things to where they were, and obviously help the species
Right.
that have probably been struggling for 30 years.
Right, and we're not going to be able to we're not changing the whole landscape at all, so just really a small portion of it. But yeah, it's one of the things that we did find was they had these crustaceans that live in the sand, and they had been dormant for 17 years. And so when the water came up, everything turned green right at the edge, and people couldn't figure it out. And then they went and looked at it under a microscope, and it was these little crustaceans, and the birds were coming in and eating. I mean, it just brought the cycle right back. And so it's just pretty cool to see nature and how resilient it really is. So, other questions? Yeah.
Going to do another pulse next spring?
Yeah, good question. No, this was a one time in 5 years. As I said, the river hadn't come through here in 17 years, and our goal is to, when we negotiate the permanent agreement, to get it once every 5 to 7 years. That's what I mean. We're never going to have it back to where it was. And this used to be an area that was so lush and a lagoon, and there were so many birds that you couldn't see the sun sometimes. And so we're never going to get that back. But our goal is to see if we can do this every 5 to 7 years and kind of build it into the way we manage the Colorado River. So.
Is new construction out west predicated on the availability of water, or do they just build it and then cross fingers?
It's a great question. It depends on the state that you're in, whether you have to tie your new development to a water supply. But in our case, most of these places, I think Arizona, Colorado now have laws that say you have to prove a 100-year water supply. But you got to enforce that. And who's the judge that's going to be like, oh yeah, you have that and you don't. But we are starting to see some court cases where they're saying you don't have enough water to grow. So I think we're going to keep bumping up against that. And I think that graph I showed you has definitely scared people. And Arizona, I'll just say, is anyone here from Arizona? Okay, just checking. Arizona used to really be in denial about this. Oh, we don't have a problem, because they have this kind of artificial world they've created, and they were in denial. And now it's on the story, it's on the front page every single day is something. I mean, as I said, when I work with the Phoenix water manager, and she was saying, when the story about Phoenix running out of water shows up on the New York Times, front page of the New York Times, she starts getting calls from Wall Street saying, what should we do about your bond rating? I mean, it starts to trickle into or move into an economic sector pretty quickly. So I think Phoenix is now taking it pretty seriously.
Is there a complacency that happens when you get daily bombarded with people that I don't hear it? Where is it getting too much?
So the question is whether,
You're trying to balance you want to create partnerships, you want to do all those things.
Yeah.
You want to be on the front page, but I want to be on the front page every day.
right, yeah, so the question is whether whether it becomes too much, like bombarding the public with this. And we still have a lot of education to do. So I would say we're not to that point yet, but I'm always fascinated how little people know about where their water comes from. And Denver, the Denver Front Range area gets half of its water from the Colorado River, and most people don't know that. So people in Denver are like, it's a terrible problem over on the Colorado River. It doesn't affect us. And it's like, actually half of your water's coming from there. So part of what we're trying to do is the more stories we can get on the paper right now, the better, because we do need to educate people. Just like in California right now, it is an incredible drought there. And they've got it on billboards, they've got it everywhere. And that's the only way you tend to get change and we're not there yet. Maybe one day we would be. Yes, last question, I think.
I'm not familiar with the West at all of these issues, but I do know there are water conservation methods and things from the Israeli systems. Have some of these cities began to address and utilize some of these water conservation systems in cities, like
Yeah.
the Israeli ones?
Right. The question is whether if we're starting to adopt conservation measures from other countries like Israel. We're slowly getting there. We're starting to do a lot of desal. Desal is very energy intensive.
Yes.
In the Middle East, that works pretty well because they have a lot of oil, but it's a bigger issue here. And it has a lot of marine issues in our oceans, so that pulling in water, things like that so desal's one, and that's a big thing that Israel does. I will say in the United States, we use way more water than everyone else. In the West, the water use per capita is about 200 gallons per day per person. In Australia, it's about 30 per day, gallons per person per day. So we got a lot of catching up to do, and I think that's one of the messages we're always saying is we have a lot of room, and it's not going to affect our quality of life so negatively. But I think we are also starting to really look at the technology options that we have.
Recycling water, that's what I'm
Reuse is a big thing. Yes, yes. Reuse, in like Colorado, they have a state-of-the-art reuse facility, and I think that we're going to see those kinds of things expand. It's just got to be part of the equation. So, okay, are we done? Thank you, everybody.